When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the world watched history unfold. The D-Day landings were the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted, an operation that changed the course of World War II. But victory on the beaches was only the beginning. Just a few miles inland lay one of the most formidable natural defenses in Europe, the thick, tangled hedgerows of Normandy. What happened next was a battle of ingenuity, courage, and adaptation. And at the center of it all was one American soldier, Sergeant Curtis G. Cullin Jr., whose simple invention turned the tide of the Normandy campaign. This is his story. When Allied forces broke through the beaches and pushed inland in June 1944, they expected open countryside. A perfect place for tanks to maneuver, they thought. Instead, they found a maze of earthen embankments, centuries-old hedgerows, dense walls of earth and vegetation up to 10 feet high and just as thick. These were not mere shrubs. They were ancient farm boundaries built up over generations, fortified with roots, stone, and clay. The Americans called them bocage country, and they were a defender's dream. The Germans, seasoned veterans of defensive warfare, wasted no time. They dug in along every hedgerow, transforming the French countryside into a deadly chessboard. Each field became a fortress, every crossing a potential ambush. Tanks could not see over or through the hedgerows. Infantry could not advance without exposing themselves. The result? The Allied advance ground to a crawl. A single mile could cost dozens of lives. By late June, the Allies were desperate. Despite numerical superiority and air dominance, they were losing men and momentum in the narrow lanes of Normandy. The American First Army, led by General Omar Bradley, needed a way to break through the walls of green. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullin Jr. was a tank commander in the U.S. 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Born in Long Island, New York, he was a mechanic by trade and a natural problem solver by temperament. Like so many American soldiers, Cullin found himself stuck in the bocage, watching his tank's cannon and armor rendered nearly useless. The Sherman tank, so effective in open battle, became a death trap in the hedgerows. Every attempt to drive through a wall of greenery ended in disaster. The tank would mount the embankment, exposing its thin underbelly, and before the driver could correct, German Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns would tear through it. Cullin later recalled, "We'd push up to the hedge and get hung there like a turtle on a fence." The Krauts would be waiting every time it was a situation no textbook could solve. What the Allies needed wasn't more firepower. They needed innovation. In early July 1944, while his unit was near the small French village of Saint-Lô, Cullin began to experiment. He scavenged a piece of German steel from a destroyed roadblock, a crude barricade made of railroad iron. He cut and welded pieces into a rough set of tusks that he bolted to the front of his Sherman tank. The concept was simple but brilliant. Instead of climbing the hedgerow, his tank would slice through it. Fellow soldiers laughed when they saw it. The contraption looked more like a farm implement than a weapon of war. But when Cullin tested his creation, the laughter stopped. His modified tank crashed through the hedgerow effortlessly, carving a path for others to follow. An officer observing the experiment immediately recognized its potential. "Get that man to Bradley," he said. Within days, word of the hedgerow cutter reached the highest ranks of the First Army. General Bradley was stunned by the idea's elegance. It didn't require new technology, expensive materials, or long training. Any unit with a welder could modify its tanks. Bradley later described Cullin's invention as one of the most ingenious mechanical innovations of the war. The design was soon refined and standardized. Engineers cut up thousands of steel beach obstacles, left behind by the Germans on D-Day, and turned them into hedgerow cutters. The final version was a series of sharp, triangular prongs welded to the lower front of a tank, known officially as the Cullin hedgerow device. In military slang, it became known as the Rhino. By late July, over 500 Sherman tanks had been fitted with the device. Each could now punch through the bocage like a charging bull, allowing infantry to follow and clear the way for reinforcements. On July 25, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the long-awaited breakout from Normandy. General Bradley's forces were tasked with smashing through the German lines south of St. Lo. This was the true test of Cullin's invention. At dawn, American bombers unleashed a massive aerial assault, over 3,000 planes dropping more than 7,000 tons of explosives. When the dust settled, the hedgerows that had trapped the Allies for nearly 2 months stood waiting. But this time, the Shermans were ready. Cullin's Rhino tanks led the assault. Instead of clumsily climbing over obstacles, they burst straight through them, splitting the thick hedges like paper, catching the Germans by surprise. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was unleashed shortly afterward, later remarked, "The Hedgerow cutters turned our tanks from sheep into wolves." The results were spectacular. The German defensive line crumbled. In just 1 week, Allied forces advanced 20 miles, faster than they had in the entire previous month. Towns like Avranches fell, and the road to Brittany and Paris opened wide. The Hedgerow cutter had transformed the battlefield. For his innovation, Sergeant Cullin was promoted and personally commended by General Bradley. He was later awarded the Legion of Merit, a rare honor for a non-commissioned officer. Bradley himself said, "In war, it's often the man with a wrench, not the man with the stars, who wins the battle." Yet despite his contribution, Cullin remained humble. He reportedly shrugged off the praise, saying, "It was just common sense. We were tired of getting shot at." After the war, Cullin returned to civilian life, never seeking fame or fortune. He continued to work as a mechanic, living quietly in New Jersey. He passed away in 1964 at the age of 48, a modest man whose ingenuity helped liberate a continent. The story of the Hedgerow cutter is more than a tale of wartime mechanics. It's a reminder that innovation often comes from the ground up, from soldiers facing the problem firsthand. While generals strategized, it was an NCO in a muddy field who found the key to victory. Military historians often compare Cullin's invention to the long lineage of field improvisations that changed warfare, from Roman engineers building bridges under fire to Civil War soldiers turning train rails into armor. In Normandy, the Hedgerow cutter stood in that same proud tradition. Moreover, the Rhino symbolizes a distinctly American approach to war: adaptability, resourcefulness, and pragmatism. Where other armies might have accepted the terrain as an immovable obstacle, the Americans turned it into a challenge to be engineered away. The Hedgerow cutter was born from necessity, and necessity came at a terrible cost. Before its introduction, the Allied forces had suffered heavy casualties in the hedgerows. Entire units were decimated trying to cross just a few miles of countryside. Infantrymen often joked grimly that Normandy had a sniper behind every leaf. In that environment, every advancement in equipment could mean the difference between life and death. The Rhino tanks didn't just improve mobility, they saved lives. Soldiers could now attack with the element of surprise. Tanks could stay low behind cover, and artillery could follow with precision. For many, the strange metal tusks welded to the front of their tanks became a symbol of survival and hope. Cullin's story is one among many examples of battlefield ingenuity during World War II. Across every front, soldiers were forced to invent solutions on the fly. In North Africa, British mechanics welded sand shields to their tanks to keep engines from choking in desert dust. In the Pacific, American Marines improvised flamethrower tanks by modifying standard Shermans. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops turned tractor parts into improvised armored carriers. These were not products of military think tanks or defense contractors. They were born of human creativity under fire. Sergeant Cullin stood as a representative of those unsung engineers, the men who took scrap metal and turned it into salvation. Today, a replica of Cullin's original hedgerow cutter stands on display at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor in Fort Knox, Kentucky. In Normandy, reenactments and museums often showcase Rhino tanks, and historians continue to emphasize their pivotal role in the summer of 1944. Military innovation experts even cite Cullin's work as a classic case study in bottom-up innovation, where frontline experience drives technological advancement faster than any command directive could. The U.S. Army later institutionalized this principle, creating rapid field engineering programs inspired by Cullin's model. In modern warfare, from Iraq to Ukraine, that same philosophy endures: adapt, improvise, overcome. Curtis Cullin never became a household name. There were no parades, no medals of valor pinned before cheering crowds. His fame remained confined to military circles and engineering lore. But among the men who served under the hedgerows, he was a legend. His invention made survival possible and victory attainable. When the Allied columns finally rolled out of Normandy and into the open plains of France, many soldiers painted crude rhino horns on their tanks in tribute. It was their way of saying thank you to a man most had never met. War, at its heart, is a contest of adaptation. For every mighty weapon forged in laboratories, there are countless small innovations born in the mud, ideas that change everything. Sergeant Curtis Cullin's hedgerow cutter was one such idea. It didn't look like much, just welded scrap on the front of a tank, but it embodied the spirit of ingenuity that defined the Allied war effort. From the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Paris, Cullin's creation helped open the way to victory. And so, while his name may not appear in most history books, his legacy lives on, in every soldier, mechanic, and engineer who looks at an impossible problem and says, "There's a way through." And that's the incredible story of Sergeant Curtis Cullin, the man whose battlefield invention helped break the stalemate in Normandy and change the course of World War II. If you enjoyed this story of ingenuity and courage, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel as an offering to the gods of the algorithm. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring. And remember, sometimes victory begins with a single spark of imagination.